If my suspicion is correct, all of you, those who are customarily watching this from home, will be joined by all the members of our church as well to witness this sermon from the comfort of their living rooms, because the snow is coming. And for the sake of maintaining the safety of all our people, we are anticipating that all of you will have to be at home to watch this sermon. Nonetheless, I record it for the sake of commemorating our good brother, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., our fellow citizen who reminded us so very, very often of the costs that may be required for saving democracy. Here is the scripture for us this day from Isaiah, one of King's favorite prophets. Isaiah 27, the 12th and the 13th verse. In that day the Lord will thresh from the flowing Euphrates to the Wadi of Egypt. And you, Israel, will be gathered up one by one. And in that day a great trumpet will sound. Those who were perishing in Assyria and those who were exiled in Egypt will come and worship the Lord on the holy mountain in Jerusalem. Sound the horn for justice. Nearly 60 years on, and still we remember with electric clarity that sweltering day in August when Americans of every hue and color gathered on the Mall in Washington, D.C. to press the case for civil rights and the guarantee for them under the law. People came on buses. They came by rail and motor vehicle to stand witness in a turbulent time of bruising injustice and vicious racial hostility. Black Americans were exiled in the land of their birth. In the local municipalities and federal authorities had shown our citizens of color the back of the hand whenever they appealed for just accords in the sweeping changes required to usher them in. Protests grew in number through town after town throughout the South, and eventually even moved to cities in the North. And the alarms sounded became more aching, more deafening, and more insistent, with every cry of justice now, freedom now, not tomorrow, but right now. For many who hoped to sustain the unholy status quo, the protests, so far as they were concerned, represented a violent challenge to the peace, to social stability, and to their exalted right of place. They would say, why do the niggers fuss and fume? They know their place, and so do we. They think more highly of themselves than they should. Dress them down, that's our cue. Give them the water's fierce and forceful spray, and then lay the dogs on them to scratch and tear their legs. That'll teach them. I remember now that I saw the nightly news when but a boy, one dark and sullen dreary night. 700 black boys and girls in Birmingham had stayed home from school to march in the streets and to say out loud that racial segregation was unjust and that justice had been hijacked by police on horseback. The fire department screwed their hoses for jetting water and aimed them at the unarmed boys and girls. They rolled them in the streets and plastered them against the walls of shops and stores. The water knocked them over and tumbled them along the roads. Their shirts ripped open and their dresses tousled overhead. What had they done? I wondered as I looked on from the safety of our living room where the flickering black and white blared the news. Why this deluge of water guns, snarling dogs, and bitter brace-backed angry cops? I saw boys and girls not much older than me, handled with malice and unbridled fury for daring to say that they were human, with a human heart and a human brain. But force was the response from the Commissioner of Public Safety, Bull Connor, a force so vile that the roar of public disapproval could be heard throughout the land. Meanwhile, Birmingham authorities took a young Baptist minister into custody for his involvement in organizing protesters and training them in techniques of, get this, nonviolent resistance. From his jail cell, a 34-year-old Martin Luther King penned a letter in response to 8 white clergymen who hoped to dissuade him in his use of the church as a spearhead in the pursuit of social justice and interracial amity. King's response was couched in the language of urgency. It was polemical, erudite, and unapologetic in its scathing critique of the white moderate church. And with a preacher's flair for reciting scripture, he reminded his white colleagues that as Paul had carried the gospel of Jesus Christ far beyond his city of Tarsus to every corner of the Greco-Roman world, that he, King, likewise, was compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond his own hometown to every small village and large city in the United States of America. He eloquently asserted that a threat to justice anywhere was a threat to justice everywhere. A point once made was quite obvious to all of them. He informed them that he and they were tied together in a single garment of destiny, and that whatever affected one directly affected all indirectly. He insisted upon them being his brothers, that he was theirs. It was a stirring broadside in defense of direct action to stir up and to disturb the negative peace that smothers human freedom. King spoke of the righteous tension and the prophetic provocation required to break the spell of oppression and injustice masked as law. Before he had finished his long letter, he told them of his arch disappointment in their appeals to moderation, to patience, and the gradual unfolding of the new day of freedom, for which Black people had longed over the course of the past 3 centuries. How long were they supposed to wait? King famously retorted that justice too long delayed is justice denied. King had a genius for image, for metaphor and story, but it was inspired by his thorough knowledge of the scriptures, the majesty of prophetic utterance in the Old Testament, and the power of a story well told in the Gospels. He could turn a phrase because he could feel the pulse of the Psalms. He shared his dream because he knew the precedent in biblical literature of dreamers like Joseph, Peter, and Paul. I am grateful on this day to remember his invocation of Amos, demanding that justice should roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Even now, I have hope in this sinful age of big lies and base counseling congressmen and congresswomen that King's Isaiah will have the last word someday. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low. And the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. For the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. I mean, you just have to take a moment and just receive that. It's good news. But if King was stirred and inflamed by the oratory of verse, it was because he saw the intimacy of beauty bound up with the cry for justice. King's preaching, whatever else you may wish to say of it, was beautiful. His tongue never twisted, and his throat never closed. He spoke of molehills and the curvaceous slopes of mountains and sang his prose. He spoke of rivers, lakes, and ocean and praised with poems. But when he preached, he celebrated our brotherhood and sisterhood and imagined that we might make music from all our host. King relished our symphony of freedom and decried the jangling discord of bigotry. And this is why he posed himself a drum major, high-stepping audaciously and twirling his long baton, whistling above the pounded drum and the blaring trumpet's call. If you want to call me a drum major, he famously preached towards the end of his lays. Say that I am a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. King knew even before he died that God's justice was on the move and that God's righteousness was ever dawning. He knew that widows and orphans now numbered in the millions of black and brown people in diaspora throughout this rugged land. But he also foresaw what Isaiah saw and what God had shown to Moses, that we one day would enter the promised land. The shout of a carbine rifle bushwhacked King, and while it managed to murder the dreamer, it could not kill the dream. The dream is a vision of universal brotherhood and sisterhood, and it imagines free people flourishing in the gifts imparted by the divine and holy will of God. The dream is infectious and moves with irresistible momentum from heart to heart and from breast to breast. It grants new sight to those who once were blind and a new hearing to those who once were deaf. Listen once more. Do you hear that noise? It's a noise I clearly hear. I know you hear it too, that raucous, screeching noise that screams its nihilistic no to free and fair elections. Do you hear the clamor of the privileged few barking orders to arm for war? To tear the nation asunder and to trample all the poor? I hear it. Do you see that darkened cloud shrouding all our land while a distant trumpet rings out taps for our dead democracy? Only a fool would fail to see and hear the troubling sounds of these chilling and desperate times. But there is another trumpet, so pleasing to my ears. It sings a recitative to Isaiah's prophetic air, the one he raised for the exiled children of Israel. It now sounds of God's promise to God's children in these latter times. Come, Isaiah, and let us hear. Let King channel your words from yesteryear. How'd you put it, Isaiah? Way back then? How can it go here today? In this day, the Lord will thresh from the flowing Mississippi to the Chattahoochee of Georgia. And you, the sons and daughters from bondage born, will be gathered up one by one. And in that day, a great trumpet will sound, and those who were perishing in Alabama and those who were exiled in Louisiana will come and worship the Lord on the holy mountain of the Blue Ridge. Don't ask. Don't ask how we might sing the songs of Zion in a strange land. Just give me my instrument and let me stand to blow the walls of injustice down. And let freedom reign throughout this land from mountaintop to shining sea. Let the justice God ordained be our crowning glory beyond the trees. The forest here, the forest there, the forest primeval everywhere. Sound the trumpet from the woods and raise its lyric beyond the skies. Then lift up your heads, O ye gates, and let the King of glory come in. Amen.